Warm welcome to all our participants joining us today from around the world. My name is Amir Bar, and I'm the Program Manager of UN Energy in Sustainable Energy for All. It's a pleasure to start our first session of Policy Dialogue series under the Africa Renewable Energy Manufacturing Initiative, which we will call RME just to make it easy. So today's discussion will focus on fostering a green manufacturing ecosystem within the Global South. This really extends beyond bridging the connectivity gap, but also stimulating economic growth and to empower the Global South to actively contribute to achieving climate goals. The RME initiative aims to harness the vast potential of RE manufacturing to create jobs, enhance local value creation, and fast track to energy transition in Africa. By drawing from global success stories in green industries and leveraging strategic partnerships, we aim to unlock the continent's manufacturing potential. Throughout this series, we will discuss the industrial policies that are essential for nurturing domestic manufacturing sectors, specifically highlighting success stories, learning from national programs, and facilitating exchange of ideas among policymakers. With that, I'd like to say a massive thank you to our esteemed panelists for being with us today, and I know we are all eager to dive into their insights. Additionally, I'd like to express our gratitude to the supporters of RME, including Bloomberg Philanthropies, ClimateWorks Foundation, the Chinese Renewable Energy Industries Association, and Africa Climate Foundation for their support. Finally, this session is being recorded for those who cannot be with us today live, and the recording will be made available on our website later. And now, with that further ado, I'll pass the floor to my colleague Divyam for his presentation on this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amir, for those opening remarks. And what we'd like to do over the next perhaps 6 to 7 minutes is to share a little bit more about the Africa Renewable Energy Manufacturing Initiative, or Africa REMI, and the activities that we have ongoing, but also what the priority countries and solutions are. So as Amir mentioned, the REMI, the initiative was launched early last year, so January last year, at the World Future Energy Summit. Thanks to our partners, Bloomberg Philanthropies and others, including African Climate Foundation, ClimateWorks Foundations, and CREA. And the objective really has been to see how we can better link the energy transition objectives and goals and ambitions of the African continent with their industrialization and job creation objectives. I think one of the underlying motivations has been that as we look to transition to a future that has more renewables in it and more that transitions towards electric mobility, how do we not replace one form of commodity dependence with another and build some of those resilient, inclusive supply chains? When we launched the initiative itself, it was accompanied by a landscape study, which is available on the SE4All website, which really looked at what some of the gaps and opportunities are for renewable energy manufacturing on the continent. I think when we look at some of the broad challenges that still face the sector in terms of growth, they range from essentially the production factors, so inadequate technical manufacturing capabilities, or the lack of human capacity around education and training programs that focus on the manufacturing side, constrained infrastructure, particularly around the cost and unreliability of electricity, but also logistics. And then other challenges that are centered around the regulatory framework that can support the local manufacturing ecosystem, the lack of availability of supply and demand side incentives, supply chains that can actually help in aggregation of demand. As we know, that is another big factor that influences investment decisions, particularly as far as manufacturing capacity is concerned, and how whether regional trade and those policies are enabling aggregation to a certain extent. But also around sort of the existing import barriers and the commitment to the sector development and growth, whether that exists or not in those countries. So looking at sort of the broad landscape, we kickstarted the initiative focusing on 3 countries initially: Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana. And we looked at sort of three particular energy transition solutions. So solar module assembly, batteries assembly, but also electric mobility, which is coming up quite aggressively and strongly in a number of these markets where we saw high opportunities for localization as far as manufacturing is concerned. And then this year, we are now expanding the countries where we'll be focusing on to include increasingly South Africa, Morocco, as well as Egypt. So broadly looking at a combination of six countries and three energy transition solutions. This is not to say that that the limit and the ambit of the program is limited to these countries. I think as we've been implementing the program, we are seeing that there's tremendous opportunities for South-South collaboration, even within the continent, between countries where existing programs and initiatives are in place, but also across regions, whether it's South Asia and Southeast Asia or Latin America. And we have representation here on the panel from all the three regions, and which will speak to some of the common elements and common themes that exist in terms of ambitions and way forward for attracting investments in local manufacturing. Um, in terms of sort of our pillars of activity, there are four key areas where we are currently focused on. One is around policy, which we see as a key driver for investments to come in. So while the focus traditionally has been on the deployment side of the story for renewables and energy transition solutions, a lot more attention has to go into the broader set of industrial policies that are required, whether that's around trade, whether that's around education and training, whether that's around setting up industrial parks and supply side and demand side incentives. So really bringing in the entire suite of policy measures that investors require for them to have the confidence to invest in long-term manufacturing, but also develop local firm level capabilities and the human capacity that can sustain the sector. So it is actually in that context that this virtual policy dialogue series has also been started, where we see that different countries are essentially going through a similar learning curve in terms of deploying those industrial policy tools. And there is that opportunity for cross-regional sharing of best practices and lessons, which we are hopeful that this platform can facilitate. The second pillar is around human capacity building, so people. We see again a lot of focus on, for instance, skills building on O&M side, operation side. But as we look at sort of upcoming sectors, particularly manufacturing sectors with solar module assembly, electric vehicle assembly, there are significant skills gaps that need to be addressed, whether that's technical for technicians who are assembling electric buses, for example, and how do we sort of deliver those scaling programs and training programs and tailored curriculum to be able to support the sector as it scales up quite rapidly. The other pillar is around Anchor. Here, sort of looking at existing large scale manufacturers, whether they are in Southeast Asia, South Asia, China, or any other part of the world, to try and see, if they're looking to expand footprint into the African continent, to expand local manufacturing in the African continent, either to meet local demand or for export purposes. How can we facilitate and provide the data and the analytical base and the facilitation to support them in that process? And the fourth pillar is essentially working with local private sector companies on the African continent that are pioneering local manufacturing for a number of these solutions. So we have a few on the panel today, but we are engaging with over 17 companies that are currently assembling batteries, electric vehicles, in the process of setting up solar PV module facilities, module assembly facilities, to try and see how we can provide end-to-end facilitation and support to these companies as they grow through their journey, whether that's trying to find a OEM partner or trying to look for tailored skills development programs for them, or access grants and look for information around those, or just providing data and analytics to support their decision-making process. So between these four pillars, we believe that we address some of these key challenges and barriers that we've identified through our landscape work, and from a bottom-up approach, really try and build or set the foundations for a sustainable and a competitive manufacturing sector that delivers on not just the energy transition objectives for countries, but also on the industrialization and job creation goals that governments may have. Finally, to say that we're also working on a number of knowledge products, whether those are country-specific manufacturing opportunity guides, so country profiles in terms of their current ambitions, growth of renewables deployment. Also looking at manufacturing investment and policy guides that give potential investors and other stakeholders more information on what kind of existing policies exist, what kind of existing incentives exist for those looking to invest in manufacturing, but also looking at sort of the institutions that are involved and the grants that are potentially available for the private sector and other developers to access through various windows. And this is essentially going to be developed and updated on a regular basis. So please be on the lookout for these. We'll be rolling these out very soon, within a matter of few weeks, and then expanding that as we look at more countries moving forward. So maybe with that, I will pause and thank you very much for your attention. And I think with that, I pass on the floor to Lolade Abiola, my colleague, who will kickstart the panel discussion from here on.
Thank you very much, Divyam, and a warm welcome to our esteemed panelists and audience. I thank you for joining us here today. So our speakers bring with them a vast experience from across a wide range of geographies and expertise, and will no doubt inspire insightful and engaging conversation about the opportunities for renewable energy manufacturing. So before we begin, a few housekeeping rules. We will start off with a round of discussions with our panelists. While the conversation is ongoing, I encourage the audience to please put any questions you may have in the chat. After the first round of discussions, we will pause and then go to some of your questions. Some of them, the speakers will be able to answer directly on the chat, and some of them will pull out for questions to be answered verbally. So let's begin with perspectives from the private sector to identify what it will take from a policy perspective to bring more investments into renewable energy manufacturing in Africa, and then bring in experiences from other regions. So we have with us here today, Jit Bhattacharya, who is the co-founder and CEO of Basigo, a company that is at the forefront of the electric mobility revolution in Kenya, electrifying its public transportation system. So you're welcome, Jit. As Basigo looks to scale up local assembly of electric buses and expand its product portfolio in Kenya and the region, what are your main asks from the policy and regulatory environment in the markets you operate in? What do you believe is working and what do you believe is not working?
Well, first of all, Lolade, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to share our experience. As you shared, so Basigo, we are a financing and infrastructure company hoping to accelerate the transition to clean electric buses in many African cities. We began here in Kenya. We have also recently expanded into Rwanda. And that's relevant specifically to your question because we are seeing different industrial policy right now between Kenya and Rwanda. And I think this is really a moment for many African governments to evaluate these different policies and what makes the most sense. And it's not black and white by any means. There's many different forces. Obviously, many African governments are quite eager to accelerate the e-mobility transition. We have seen governments like Rwanda really take the lead on this by providing especially very favorable tax policies to allow for the import of various forms of electric vehicles, duty-free, excise tax-free, without VAT, and that rapidly allows, and we're seeing the same thing in Ethiopia right now. So that's one way to go through and accelerate an industry. But there is another need, and we see that in Kenya as well. Many African countries also want to strongly incentivize local automotive manufacturing and the jobs that come with it, the technical skills that come with it. And Kenya is a great example. Kenya has a legacy policy that allows for any vehicle that's coming in as a complete knockdown kit it basically receives no import duty and no excise tax. And then recently, Kenya, separate from all of that, passed a VAT exemption for e-mobility. And so a lot of the questions in Kenya have revolved around, well, is there going to be anything special done for e-mobility where basically vehicles could be brought in fully built and they would be duty-free, but that works against the goal of creating this automotive manufacturing sector. And so right now, what we are really proud of is in Kenya, we have established the first local electric bus manufacturing line. I wish I could do screen share. We actually have a great time-lapse video of it. Our first 2 locally assembled buses, they were assembled from complete CKD kits. So from, bare wheels and axles all the way up to a complete bus. They finished at the assembly line in the last week, and now they're on the road. So we're really excited, and this is a huge step for Kenya that we have been able to establish this presence. The thing that we have asked for from the policy side here in Kenya, because the challenge we have is right now in Kenya, we have overwhelming demand for electric buses. So we have demand for hundreds of buses from bus operators, and the Kenyan market is enormous. There's 100,000 registered buses here in Kenya. One of our challenges to scale is the fact that we do have to bring up this local assembly line, something we're very proud to do. But how do we do that while also meeting the government's goals of accelerating e-mobility, reducing imports of fuel, things like this? So we're really in a catch-22 here, and we're finding ourselves in a position where we're telling the Ministry of Industrialization in Kenya how proud we are to be setting up local assembly, how our intention is to get to hundreds and then eventually thousands of electric buses produced, not just for Kenya, but for the region. But that in the near term, we would like some level of exemption to be able to bring in vehicles fully built, because the one thing about e-mobility in Africa is we are all startup companies. The industry is so nascent. We need a kickstart. We need to get volume on the ground. We need to establish the infrastructure, et cetera. So it's not a straightforward answer to your question, but that's really what we're asking for from policy is support in these early years while we're all still small, consistency in policy and some levels of standard setting, and then support for those who are really trying to bring in local electric vehicle manufacturing into these countries. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much for sharing your insights. And I completely understand it's a very delicate dance between ensuring that you boost, the adoption of electric vehicles, but also ensuring that you don't sort of ruin the opportunity in the market for local manufacturing. And congratulations on the local assembly of your buses. Please share whatever, images or videos that you have. We will be happy, and I'm sure our audience will be happy to see that as well. So thank you so much.
We'll post the time lapse in the next few days. So follow us on LinkedIn and you can see how the first e-buses were built.
Perfect. So please, audience, you heard it straight from the CEO of Basigo. Please follow them and then to see sort of how things have progressed along with their manufacturing. So we've heard from Jit on what the private sector needs specifically with respect to e-mobility in East Africa. I'd like to shift the focus to Nigeria, my home country, which is now one of the most dynamic markets with a variety of solutions being deployed, ranging from distributed and interconnected mini-grids to electric vehicles. I'd like to introduce Zira Kwage, who is the Nigeria focal point for the Africa Climate Foundation. So, hi, Zira. Given the significant opportunity for renewable energy deployment, along with Nigeria's energy transition ambitions, what measures can governments and other stakeholders take to support domestic renewable energy manufacturing to meet their growing demands and in turn reduce imports and create more local value?
Thank you very much, Lolade, and I appreciate the invitation to this event. I think Nigeria is a classic example of a country with significant potential to tap from reallocation of resources that would come through energy transition on the continent. But this reallocation would depend mainly on how countries assess their competitive and their comparative advantages. I will come back to Nigeria in particular, but I would like to give a broader picture on how these advantages are very important in shaping the industrial policy or green industrialization policy that countries choose to pursue. I think some key strategies that could be applied across the board, noting differences in different countries, is the need to build trust and investor confidence. I think that's an important foundation that Divyam already highlighted and necessary that trust is necessary to bring in investment. Then the second strategy, I think, in terms of pursuing green industrialization would be to seek ways to decarbonize the existing industries as a starting point to building new greenfield green industries. And then once that is done, then the country is more set up to start manufacturing goods that are lower down the value chain ladder and then work their way up. So I'm excited that initiatives like AREMI exist, because to take these policy steps, there's a need to improve the quality of data on resource availability, a better understanding of what is economically feasible, technically feasible to extract, manufacture, process, and deploy. And then just a better understanding on some of the labor dynamics in these countries at a country-specific level. And then now to Nigeria, and this will be my last point, and I'll stop. Nigeria has ample, resources to manufacture components of solar products and even accessories. But we currently import about 85% of these components, whereas more than 90% can actually be produced in Nigeria. There's a PwC report on this that was published last year. And these imports cost about $500 million a year. So imagine if that production is domesticated, it saves a lot of foreign exchange that goes out of the shores, and it helps build local industries, create job opportunities, and I'm optimistic that groups like AREMI can tap into such potentials. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Zera. And you're absolutely right. We are working very hard, along with partners like yourselves as well, to see how we can support that local manufacturing, even with regards to critical minerals. How do we retain value on continent and reduce, the over-reliance on importation as well? So it's a combination of policy and also working very closely with the private sector to really, showcase the opportunity. So now turning to the South African experience with Gaylor Montmar-Sinclair, who is the Senior Economist at Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies. Hi, Gaylor. So as South Africa looks to better link the energy transition with local industry development and also reduce imports, what actions are emerging as the key policy enablers to support a competitive and thriving local renewable energy manufacturing sector?
Yeah, thank you, Lorade, and really thank you to AREMI for the invitation. And I think well done convening that platform. I think it's really critical that we learn a lot more from our peers in the Global South. And so I think that is really an important start. And from the South African perspective, we've been trying to crystallize our thoughts and our policy drive through the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan, which is really a social compact between government, business, and labor to put forward our vision and key interventions that we want to drive the renewable energy industry, and importantly, build the value chains in the renewable energy and battery storage industries domestically. Effectively, it comes down to three key elements. The first one is demand, demand, and demand. And I think I cannot emphasize this enough. Getting as much demand as we can domestically, and of course, regionally, but within national borders is what really can be influenced by national government, is critical. And so that means unlocking the physical infrastructure, which is the grid, but also the market infrastructure. The ability to trade, to wheel, to buy and sell. It requires to make the environment very easy to work into. And so we have now an energy one-stop shop that has been set up to help investors develop energy projects. It makes the landscape clearer and easier to invest. It's really also important to see that it's a multiplicity of markets and understand them almost as one. It can be coming from the public sector, it coming from the private sector, it comes from residential. And it's only by tapping into all markets that effectively we can be successful when it comes to building the manufacturing. And so we need strong government programs when it comes to rolling out, on government buildings and public structures. But we also need significant, support and enablement for investment by the private sector and by households and small businesses. So that's the first aspect around the demand. And for me, that is just really so critical. The second thing is we mustn't kid ourselves. Demand is not enough. It's a very competitive environment. We have market leaders in Europe, in the US, in China, and other countries. If we're serious about building manufacturing, we're going to need to put some sort of incentive and support. And so for us, we're putting forward the case to enable a tax incentive for both greenfield and brownfield manufacturing investment in facilities that are in the renewable energy and the battery storage value chains. We're looking at using public demand as an anchor. What do I mean by that? If government has its finger in the procurement, it could be direct procurement, it could be a grant, it could be a subsidy, it could be a loan. It should come with some degree of localization. It should be linked. And we need to be very intentional about this. It's really critical. Of course, we need to also support new entrants and emerging suppliers so that we diversify the value chain. But we have to do that quite organically. Sorting out the issues around testing and certification, also quite important. This is something that in South Africa comes as a challenge with having manufacturers having to go overseas to certify products. In the grand scheme of things, setting up a testing and certification facility is a drop in the ocean in terms of cost. It doesn't cost a lot of money, and it enables an industry. So it's really critical that we do that. And look at what we can do in terms of export market, particularly through our special economic zones, but also regional collaboration, particularly in Southern Africa. We're looking around the lithium and battery value chain, what is possible. And lastly, I think the broader ecosystem is important, particularly in two main areas. One is skills, making sure that we have the right skills in the country. And so we have set up a matchmaking platform between industry and our education and training institutions to make sure that what comes out of the training system actually answers the need of industry, and that vice versa. When graduates will come out of the system, there's already a bit of a pipeline for them to enter the labor market. And we obviously enable that through a variety of platforms, including internships and learnerships and so forth. And secondly, it's around technology readiness. For us, we also have to accept that for most technological development in South Africa, we're not at the cutting edge. In terms of R&D, we cannot compete. So we need to be very fast in terms of adopting new technologies, good technology adopters. And so here, putting together key clusters under the leadership of key OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, but also being innovative on things like de-risking trials of new technologies and testing new technologies is something that we've been piloting. So, this is effectively kind of the ecosystem of measures from the demand side and supply side, and sort of broader elements that we're putting forward through the Renewable Energy Master Plan. Additionally, and I don't have time to get into it now, of course, we've got a big emphasis on making this as inclusive as possible, enabling new entrants, enabling transformation, and so that it's organic from the start. And so for me, that is really sort of what we're putting forward overall. And it's really just important to acknowledge that all these components are equally important, and that relying just on one would not take us to manufacturing. It would take you to a market. They could create a massive amount of renewable energy, but it won't necessarily lead to localization. And it's really important if we want to build manufacturing that we are very intentional around these different elements.
Thank you so much, Gilor, for your very detailed and sort of very well laid out sort of response. And it's clear from what you said that multiple actions need to be deployed simultaneously if we really want to move the needle and, as you say, really make an impact to really scale up renewable energy manufacturing in Africa. And I really do hope that TIPS is able to move the needle and do quite a lot in South Africa as well. And from a lot of our engagements, what is becoming clear is that a range of incentives, and you mentioned this, Galore, are needed to attract investment in manufacturing. India, for instance, has announced an ambitious production-linked incentive scheme to encourage solar manufacturers to venture further upstream into cells and wafer manufacturing. To share insights from the India experience, we have with us Subramaniam Pulipakar, who is the CEO of the National Solar Energy Federation of India. And if you don't mind, I'll call you Subbu. So Subbu, what has been the outcome of the incentives so far? And what are some of the key lessons emerging from its implementation? As we've heard, from Galore, we really need to look at how we can also start, becoming innovative with regards to new technology. So we're looking forward to hearing your response.
Thank you very much, Rolande. And at the outset, huge congratulations to you and entire team at SE4All for the REMI initiative. I think it is the right time that we need to be more serious on creating domestic value chains and strengthening them. India, as you mentioned, until 2019, we were one of the largest importers of solar modules in the world. We were importing almost 90% of our entire value chain. But we understood and realized that, and also partially thanks to COVID, that the supply chain is very vulnerable, and we need to achieve, in order to achieve true energy independence and security, it is imperative to strengthen global domestic supply chains while reducing dependency on the imports. So the production-linked incentive scheme was launched in 2021. The first tranche was almost less than $500 million, and the main objective of the scheme was not to just create a integrator value chain or an assembly value chain, but to establish an end-to-end value chain. When I say end-to-end, as you are aware, in solar, you start with mining of the quads, get the polysilicon, and then make the wafers and ingots, and then make them into cells, which are assembled into a module, and the module comes out. So most of the value chain, or most of the manufacturing across the world, apart from the major hub in Asia and China, most of it happens from cell to module, where the value addition is less, and the domestic dependency or domestic capabilities of the vertical integration or downward integration are closer to zero, including in India. So PLI 1, the tranche 1 was aimed at setting up this entire value chain, and for a total of offtake value of $500 million, the bids that were received from the manufacturer crossed almost $5 billion. Around 19 manufacturers came out, applied for the PLI, and then they wanted to build almost 53 gigawatt of solar capacity. But because of the capacity of the quantum of the budget available, which is $500 million, only 8 gigawatt could get awarded at the end. Realizing the potential and interest of the manufacturers, Indian government came out with another tranche 2, which in 2022-2023, which now has an outlay of almost $3 billion. And this time, the idea was to ensure, while we are looking at end-to-end integration, let us divide the incentive into buckets so that we can have modular integrations and then develop domestic capabilities for the raw materials and other parts of the integrated value chain. So 3 buckets were created: cell module, wafer cell module, and poly to wafer cell module. And all 3 were fully subscribed. Today, because of both tranches of the production-linked incentive, by the end of this year, India will have a total capacity of almost 75 gigawatt of only module manufacturing capacity, another 30 gigawatt of cell manufacturing capacity, and around 10 gigawatt of polysilicon and wafer. And this is just the beginning. By 2026 and early 2027, India is poised to cross the 100 gigawatt module manufacturing mark, with almost 50 to 60 gigawatt of polysilicon and wafer and ingot, making India only the second country with a double-digit manufacturing capacity on the downward integration of modules. So the lessons we have learned here are in three dimensions. One, of course, is while as an industry association, my first question or my first request would be to give incentives or request the government to give us incentives. But the ecosystem where the incentives can actually turn into manufacturable products is something that is very important. Indian government has created that ecosystem. Today, every year on a calendar year basis, bids worth 50 to 60 gigawatt are bidded out. There is huge demand on the rooftop scale in installations, on the solar pumps installations, where the domestic capacity is mandated. So the ecosystem was created so that the supply sort of kicks in to meet the demand. The second dimension was to ensure that we always, while we cannot, and Gaylor was mentioning that, we cannot imagine whether we can compete in terms of the technology from the imports. How can we innovate? So on the second dimension, what Indian government did right, and which is helping our sector, is to start at a point which can help the industry get an advantageous position. So the PLI was aimed at creating only high efficiency modules. So we have so that we don't give incentives to technologies or efficiencies or capabilities which might become outdated in 2 or 3 or 4 years. So with that, what happens is the manufacturing timeline given for the PLI winners is also 2 to 3 years. So by the time these lines come up, the modules that come out of the factory or the wafers that come out are in line with the contemporary technology or the trends that are there. So this would sort of help the incentive to be utilized in a more conducive and coercive manner, rather than having systems in place which are either at the verge of getting outdated or will get outdated. The third one was, and here I have to sort of talk specially about our role, is the engagement of the private sector in the decision making and in the policy making. Indian government boasts of a very, very intense stakeholder consultation mechanism before any scheme or incentive or system comes out. Both branches of PLI went through a rigorous process of to and fro discussions for almost, the PLI 1 took almost 2 years, the PLI 2 almost took 18 months. So there we were able to iron out the some points where the industry was hesitant, some points where the government was also considering to, enable where the industry was not that willing to. So we were able to iron out a lot of differences or potential points where the scheme might eventually not take off much ahead of the scheme's announcement or launch. So that helped in creating a good pipeline. So the second PLI 2, which is the second tranche of it, like I mentioned, now has 3 buckets compared to the PLI 1. That was the sort of a result of the discussions and deliberations of the private sector. And there were also some suggestions that the industry gave to safeguard the interests of the manufacturers who will eventually come out manufacturing the PLI. So once that confidence and assurance was given to the sector by the government via the policy and incentive, then the risk from the investor's perspective was not just minimized but was closer to zero. So now the PLI scheme is well thought of, the ecosystem is ready, the technology would be contemporary, and the industry's buy-in and investors' concerns were sort of counted. So this makes the PLI scheme, all in all, a very comprehensive and cohesive scheme. And we are very confident that we are already seeing a lot of results. And just for your information, when we started the last calendar year in Jan 2023, our cell manufacturing capacity is 2 gigawatt. When we end this calendar in December 2024, like I said, we will cross almost 50 gigawatt of almost 30 gigawatt of cell manufacturing, and it will triple in next 2 years. So that is the impact of the schemes like PLI. I'll stop here and back to you, Paula.
Thank you so much, Subbu. I think just hearing all of that, it's so impressive to see that in just about 5 years, what India has been able to do to really turn things around from importing, over 90% of its value chain to now, really being a global leader, if I must say, in manufacturing. And again, your role in supporting that for the country as well is obviously very, very credible as well. And I congratulate you for that. So if we now move on to Latin America, Brazil has seen the development of a robust manufacturing ecosystem for wind energy, with several companies engaged in turbine, blade, and wind tower manufacturing, along with many others offering ancillary products and services. We are pleased to have Dr. Elbia Ghanum, who's the CEO of the Brazilian Wind Energy Association. Hi, Elbia. So
Hi.
my first question to you is, how have policies incentivized the development of local manufacturing, and what lessons have been learned from Brazil's experience in building a competitive sector?
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. It is so nice to be here and hear a lot of experience and change experience. So about wind in Brazil, Brazil has a sealed case for wind. And we have about 3 phases with wind. We start our industry 20 years ago, exactly in 2004, when we start with a state program that is a ProInfa. It is a big program for incentives to start this industry. That time, we had a contract like FIDINTERF. It is very regular in European countries. And it is the first phase that we started to contract about 1.4 gigawatts only. But since we start in 2004, we had a very strong hold about the national contents. We have a lot of factors that can explain our success, but the national content policies is the first one, because it gives a sign for investors, for manufacturer companies produce wind turbine here in Brazil. This phase, this is the first one, the price for wind was so high, and usually we had investments in hydro plants, in big hydro plants. But we started this industry there. After this, with the first experience with ProInfa, we started to contract wind for competitive auctions. Brazil is a big example when you talk about the world to contract renewable in competitive process with auction. We started auction in 2009. I say that it is the second phase for this industry. And after 2009, this industry started to increase very fast. Nowadays, wind is the second source in our electricity metrics, and wind is the less expensive source for electricity in Brazil. We are nowadays we have about 30 gigawatts, is about 15% of installed capacity. In this second phase, we noticed that a very strong hand of the government about the policy for national contents, because we have a developed banking. Developed banking give financing for investors. There is no other way to finance this, because it's a lot of money, and they bring money from other countries. It is very high risk about the exchange rates. And with this whole, a lot of companies started to produce here. It's the main manufacturer companies is here. Nowadays, we have about 5. It's like Vestas, Siemens, WEG, Acciona, and the others. With this big manufacturer, turbine manufacturer, we constructed the whole supply chain here. We have a very strong components supply chain here, exactly because national content whole. Nowadays, we are living in the third phase of our market. This is a free market. Since 2017, 2018, we started to sell more than 80% of our contracts in free market. Why? Because we become the very cheap electricity, and the big companies, big consumers want to buy our electricity. It's because we reduce costs, of course, in 2008, 2009. But nowadays, we know it's because ESG agenda. And with these incentives from ESG agenda, climate change discussion, energy transition, we have a very cheap price for wind. Solar is going in the same shape since 2015. Solar is new when you compare with wind. And we have a very, very big source here. We have a lot of wind to produce electricity. And we have a very competitive price. We have manufacturer companies here and a very strong supply chain. And Brazil is going and increase much more gigawatts with wind. When you think about the future, the next 5, the next 10 years, the answer for electricity metrics will be in wind and solar sources. Nowadays, our metrics is 90%, 92% in renewable sources. 60% is with big hydro. But now we will increase wind and solar. When you see in the future, we can see the mostly part of generation from solar and wind. We have a lot of sources in onshore wind, and we are starting right now to exploration offshore wind. And for us, the base for this strong industry and this strong market is about the policy. It's very important to have a very strong regulatory framework that will give the medicine for investors, but it's necessary to give some incentives mechanisms very strong that can give the answer for our supply chain industry is about national contents policy. I have no doubt about this because we know that developing countries like Brazil, like Africa and the others need to have a very strong hand of the government. We know that governments in our situation, developing country, has no money. Yeah, it's necessary to attract private investors, but to attract private investor is necessary to have a very strong hold and a very strong regulatory framework. For me, in my experience in this industry with more 20 years, the point is about to have a stronghold, and this stronghold can create incentives mechanism, and these incentives need to have the right signal for investors, and the investors can feel safe, but it's necessary to have something for investors that this is national contents is a policy. I believe that our success has this very important base.
Great. Thank you so much, Elvia, for those interventions. Lolare is facing some technical issues, so I'll just briefly step in. But all great points in terms of the important role of incentives, but also laying out that developing a local manufacturing sector or an industry is a multi-decadal process. It takes time, and the government has to invest with the investment, with predictability, with the policy, with the incentives, over different phases, over perhaps 5, 10, 15 years, as long as it takes for the sector to stand on its own feet. And then that really delivers the competitiveness that you laid out for the wind energy sector in Brazil. I think also a great point on how to link deployment policy with concessional financing, which also then drives sectoral growth and deployment moving forward. So thank you so much, Albia, for those great points. We will now move to Monica, who comes from the ASEAN Center for Energy. I think something that we've heard a lot today is about demand, but also about the need for regional trade and taking a regional approach and how economic integration can help. And the ASEAN is actually an excellent example of that, where not just for the energy sector, but there is a broader economic cooperation framework that already exists. So Monica, we'd love to hear a little bit more about how you think existing regional economic blocks like the ASEAN can be leveraged to build competitive and resilient renewable energy manufacturing supply chains. And what are still some of the gaps that you see from the ASEAN experience in terms of regional cooperation?
Yeah, thank you, Divyam, and also Lolade, and also C4All. Happy to be part of this great panelists from all around the world. So responding to your questions, actually in ASEAN, yes, we have some successes that we should leverage. Like few examples is, so in ASEAN has, especially in the energy sector, we have the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation. We call it APAEC. So it is a blueprint that guides the regional discussion on energy cooperation for the past 25 years. So I would say it helps. And a few things that we proudly say that first, the region has the common renewable energy supply target of achieving 23% of the total primary energy supply by 2025, and will continuously updating it to address the latest global challenges like the adherence to reaching the net zero target. And second, we as the region also have this annual discussion again since the past 25 years to exchanges the latest priorities of each country, aspirations to the regional cooperation, and identify what are the initiatives that could benefit both national and also regional energy security. Few examples, maybe you have heard about is about the ASEAN Power Grid framework as the facility for the countries to plan and extend the grid, make it into one ASEAN grid, which still challenging because so far we only connected only the peninsular part, not yet connected to Indonesia and Philippines and also Brunei and some parts of Malaysia. And on activity basis, we have this annual convention on the highlighting the ASEAN Energy Awards and also business forum for the past 20 plus years, and to some extent have successfully gathered this multiple stakeholders from the government, investor, and also financial institution to come and sit together and discuss about potential cooperation, infrastructure development in the energy sector. And of course, we are active to also having this kind of capacity building activities, especially targeting the government officials to ensure data-driven policy-making processes. That's some of the good stories that we try to leverage more. But again, there is also many gaps. And one of the big gap is actually we are thankful with the existence of this REMI initiative. So in our regional discussion, unfortunately, we haven't touched upon this regional consensus on establishing renewable energy manufacturing, which so far as we know, the country of ASEAN actually has established to some extent their own experience due to their own national interest. Like for example, Vietnam, because they have very active solar expansion for the past 5 years, and they need it anyway to fulfill their own demand. And also Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia to some extent, because Indonesia is a country that's the biggest in the ASEAN. So basically, Indonesia see the demand growth in the region and setting up more manufacturing bases to support the region and also national need. But again, in the regional level, we haven't like really connect this country to talk with each other and to better plan in the most effective way. Especially this discussion about manufacturing is something that need regional cooperation, because like as we know, the renewable energy sources is not something that we can define. Okay, we want the solar farm to be in a specific place that we want. It needs to follow where the sun is and where the wind is. So basically, by that nature characteristic, each member states have different sort of unique resources, their own unique resources. What are the champion of the renewable energy in their country? So with that, actually, we need to share with each other, including how to set up all the supply chain. So at least regionally, we are secure together. So yeah, actually, that's the thing that we haven't have so far. So that's why REMI initiative with the kickoff last year in Indonesia was very momentous, and also really picking up the interest of the government, at least from Indonesia, to also start talking about it, because we need it anyway. So yeah, unfortunately, I didn't give you solution, but just give us what our problem is. So yeah, I will stop there and thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica, for those interventions. I think what you flag in terms of, really pushing this regional way of thinking around building supply chains. At the end, not every country will be able to do everything. Even if we think about end-to-end value chains, we find, especially Gaylor mentioned, in Southern Africa, you have different countries with complementary resources. How do we think about what those regional value chains could look like, and then align trade policies and industrial policies to then leverage on each country's comparative benefits to build a competitive sector? And also to say, as you mentioned, the Renewable Energy Manufacturing Initiative actually also has a Southeast Asia arm. We launched a report with close support of the ASEAN Center for Energy last year, which was launched also with support of ADB. And we are very much looking forward to taking that forward, taking the Southeast Asia segment of the initiative forward. And we see great collaboration opportunities between Africa and Southeast Asia, REMI there. So we see that there's a lot of questions also in the chat. Maybe I'll turn to Gaylor next. There's a question about, how industrial policies can be tailored to specifically support the growth of domestic renewable energy manufacturing in the global South. Perhaps you could reflect from your experience with the development of the Southern Africa Renewable Energy Roadmap that you mentioned in your previous intervention, which in some ways is essentially an industrial policy document as well, which would essentially lay out a vision for the sector's growth, not just from a deployment demand perspective, but also from what that means from a supply chain perspective. So perhaps you could, reflect on the experiences of the design of such a plan, how that has to be tailored to South Africa's context, and then sort of what are some of the challenges that you see in its implementation?
Yeah, sure. I think thank you for the question. I think that's extremely relevant. And as you pointed out, I mean, the SAREM, as we call it, the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan, is really an industrial development plan for South Africa. And I guess the first thing I'll say is co-creation and co-ownership is critical. And so for us, I mean, we call SAREM a social compact between government, business, and labor, and we mean it when we say that. It was really extensively consulted, co-created. We went and negotiated actual targets in a collegial fashion between government, business, and labor representative. We've had extensive engagement, and so making sure that everybody's on board with the policy, or at least the key stakeholders. You'll never get everyone on board, of course, but like the key stakeholders are on board. That is critical. Secondly, to have a dedicated body that's going to drive implementation. We call it a project management unit, but it could be any kind of unit that's independent. Of course, reports to the stakeholders, to government, to business and labor, but that has some independence in driving implementation is critical. And that's the model that we've been following for quite a few of our industrial master plans. And so that is the model that we're also pursuing through SAREM going forward, to have a dedicated unit that's well resourced and can drive as much implementation as possible. Then when it comes to the plan itself, it sounds obvious, but I'm going to say, you got to do your homework. You got to identify what are the niches that you are competitive in. And too often people tend to go to what they see as the main opportunities in other countries or globally. But that doesn't mean that, domestically or regionally, you are competitive to actually manufacture those inputs. And certainly in the South African case, what we've been finding is that we may not necessarily be competitive in manufacturing some of the sexy items, those are also big ticket items, but we're very competitive in manufacturing a lot of the inputs and in the value chain, that are instrumental into effectively a project, but are not always looked at. And so for us, it's really important to say, well, let's support the parts of the industry that actually we can do and we can do well, rather than waste resources in trying to set up capabilities where it's going to be hard to compete. And so for me, being targeted, is really critical. And then, lastly, it speaks to that sort of co-ownership, co-creation process, but having champions that are going to really drive implementation as well, across the board, in government, in business, and in labor, and having a dedicated person that's aimed to drive the elaboration of the plan, which has been my role over the last 12 months, effectively, to facilitate the development of the plan, helps a lot, because it's really a catalyst. And, you need that sort of body that's going to bring everyone together and take a bit of a step back and say, I hear you, but actually, let's just take a holistic view of, as we call it, South African Inc., sort of domestic view, and then really put forward what is best for the country rather than one or two different interests.
Thank you so much, Kilo. Those are very clear three, takeaway points for anybody that's looking to set up a industrial policy roadmap for the development of the sector at a national level. Maybe just on the point of competitiveness, and maybe I'll turn to Subbu, going back to the Indian experience. Subbu, you laid out, great big numbers in terms of where India might will likely end up by 2030 and where it is today. Talk to us a little bit about the competitiveness piece, right? So this is even when we speak to potential investors looking at the African market on the manufacturing side, the first question is on the demand side. And the second question is, well, how competitive is local manufacturing in the first place vis-a-vis imports, for instance, right? So even if we built up all of this capacity to manufacture, does it come at a premium for, is it catered to the domestic market, for the export market? How do you sort of plan out and talk through the competitiveness piece, at least in the Indian solar manufacturing story?
No, Divyam. In fact, on the both fronts, India has tried its level best to safeguard the interests of not just the manufacturers, but the entire ecosystem, including the generators and developers. On the demand side, and we, like I said, to add on to what I was mentioning before, we have now a domestic content requirement in programs where the government is subsidizing the solar power. like the rooftop solar installations which are subsidized, are mandated to use domestic cells and modules. Solar pumps are mandated to use domestic cells and modules. We have an ALMM where you can only, when you're supplying power to the grid and the off-taker is a government entity, then that warrants a domestic content. So that was the part which sort of gave more confidence to investors to come in. On the competitiveness part, India has adopted a two-phase approach. The first one is, like I was mentioning in my previous remarks, was the efficiency side of things. Like India tried to make sure that we only incentivize those technologies which are of higher efficiency and can compete on the efficiency side when it comes to comparison with imports. On the second side, we try to understand what are the cost components involved in the manufacturing process, along with the incentives that are given to companies which are importing to India, and see where India can add its value so that our module manufacturing becomes more competitive. So we have identified three things. The first and foremost important aspect in any manufacturing, not just solar, is the electricity tariff or availability of reliable electricity. So this was something that India took it very seriously and made sure that today any establishment, not just the solar manufacturing establishment, they can procure power from renewables irrespective of their capacity. And minimum they've just put 100 kilowatt, but the procurement has been made more accessible and the charges have been waived off for transmission. So that has sort of addressed the affordable electricity component of it. The second part was always on the capital interest available or accessible to a particular investor in the particular geography, and the cost of setting up, including the technology. So to address these both aspects, the government introduced the incentives. So India's incentives are not capital incentives. India's incentives are production-linked incentives. So the difference between both is miles apart. So any manufacturer who is setting up will not get an incentive to set up. He will get an incentive to produce. So the PLI is actually that will kick off after you start manufacturing. So 3 years is a period given to a manufacturer for setting up the manufacturing plant. And from the day he starts manufacturing, for 5 years, he'll get incentive. So when you're getting incentive while you're manufacturing, that is sort of appending to the delta X. That is a competitive advantage that that any importing manufacturer gets. So that was one part that the government looked at. But as an association, what we have sort of gone ahead and analyzed is, apart from the actual cost, let's say, what peak rupees to dollar cents comparison, let us look at the energy transition and opportunity cost for a country. Today, if we are able to mine our own quartz, get our own polysilicon, make a wafer, make ingot, make cell, and make module, it might be $2-3 dollar cents costlier than the imported module or cell or whatever it is. But what is the opportunity cost involved there, and is that trade-off worth it? And in any country's case, as if it is in India, that is definitely worth the trade-off. So while we are also looking at trying to address those 3-4 aspects of affordable capital, affordable access to electricity, ecosystem where the industry setup can be more cohesive, we are also looking at seeing how the manufacturers can be given sort of a more stable outlook to not just the demand, but also with respect to the way the prices are perceived in the market. Europe has a different example there. They have dedicated bids only for Europe domestic manufacturers. In India, we have dedicated sectors of solar that are only limited to domestic manufacturers. So all in all, if you look at it, the way today we look at the prices in India in terms of competitive advantages, if we are getting a high efficiency module which is made in India with entire value chain in India, then that delta X is not an issue. Last point I would like to mention is the third dimension, which India has demonstrated very well, and we are going to see the results in next 8-9 months, is the scale. So today, the scale of PLI, by the virtue of economics of scale, is going to help our manufacturing becoming more affordable and more competitive. Because, for example, any polysilicon factory less than 10 gigawatt doesn't make sense. So when you have both PLIs, the largest manufacturer that will come out of India December this year, eventually by 2027, we'll have 30 gigawatt of polysilicon manufacturing. The second largest will have 15 gigawatt of polysilicon manufacturing. So when you're able to sort of de-risk or hedge the risk in each of this vertical integration of the modules, then eventually your module becomes more complex.
Thank you so much, Subbu, for providing those insights. I'd like us to sort of move towards the capacity building side of things and really looking at skilled labor. And I want to ask Jit this question. So from your experience as an entrepreneur, what are the critical gaps you have identified with regards to skilled labor? And how can government strengthen education and training policies to address the growing needs of an emerging sector like electric mobility? I mean, you mentioned that, you've been able to assemble your 2 buses. Just give us some sort of insights into how you were able to kind of work with regards to skilled labor, and if there are any gaps and recommendations going forward.
Yeah, so the good news is when we're talking about e-mobility, whether it's buses, whether it's trucks, even whether it's motorbikes, the vast majority of the assembly process really does match the way that traditional combustion engine vehicles are already made. So you're looking at 70 to 80% of the process is similar, but then that last 20 to 30% is different. And specifically where the gap exists is when you're talking about an electric powertrain as opposed to combustion engine. We're much more in the realm of computer manufacturing, electronics manufacturing than we are in the realm of the mechanical engineering or the mechanical assembly required for a combustion engine. And so a great example of what we're finding in assembling our first 2 buses is that when we get to that tail end of the process, where we're installing the electric powertrain system, it's actually our team that has to take over, because our team has gone through and received the training from the service side to be able to actually integrate those components, bring them up. If there's a problem, diagnose that problem, find the faulty module, etc. And so it's simply a matter of training and human capacity. But we absolutely need to build that on both our manufacturing lines and in the service operations serving the vehicle fleets that are out in the market. Your question was, what can government do? That one I'm not expert on as somebody from the private sector. So I can identify the problem. I can say that any kind of government intervention will probably be too slow for us. We have to solve this problem right now with our manufacturing partners, with the OEMs who are providing those vehicles. We need to be the ones leading this solution in order to enable our business model. But our hope, and I think we're seeing this already just with the level of student interest at schools and universities, the interest now is very much around renewable energy technology, electric vehicles, things like this. So the new cohorts of students that are leading the universities now are equipped with at least a basic understanding. Now they need the practical training. So programs ideally that can help provide that practical training and upskill existing workforces, I think is one of the things that we're absolutely going to need to look for. Right now, it's okay for e-mobility because we're such small scale, but this is an industry that's growing so fast that if we don't meet that gap, it will quickly become a constraint.
Absolutely. And I think I was looking more towards with regards to institutions of higher learning or training, training colleges, because at the same time, they have to also know that we're moving towards e-mobility. So just trying to understand the need to also have the right sort of curriculum in there so that when these students do come out, they can come to organizations such as, Basigo to get that practical, hands-on training as well. But you're absolutely right. It's something that needs to be addressed right now. And the private sector is nimble enough to be able to start making those moves along with the OEM partners. So thank you very much for that.
I'd like to just add one other thing. I think the other thing that we need to be looking at here is we have a big focus, I think, on the end systems, the end vehicles, but the components actually matter very much as well. And, one of the things, going back to manufacturing and industrial policy, I responded to this in the Q&A. One of the things that we've had to request of government is in most local manufacturing incentives in the automotive sector, there's usually a requirement around local content. The portion of the vehicle that has to be local content. You'll see this from America to Kenya to all over the world, right? India as well. And the reality is here in most African countries, even for the combustion engine vehicles, we are not yet meeting those local content requirements because the tier one supply chain does not exist to be able to support them. There's a big focus on vehicle assembly because that supply chain is already there and present, and we can plug into it with the Lego bricks of what forms a vehicle. And yet the real win here, the way that we can also solve that human capacity problem is by also starting to, where government can help us is starting to create the incentives for local component manufacturing of electric powertrain components, battery packs, electric motors, power electronics, and starting to establish that supply chain is absolutely going to fill in the human capacity and the expertise that we need to now service the entire sector.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for adding that, It's very, very important. So we have a very good question on the Q&A, the chat. It says, how have industrial policies addressed the issues of electrical waste from renewable energy components? And how can partners such as SE4All and Africa Climate Foundation partner to support South-South Cooperation to support RE manufacturing? So I'd like to pose that question to Zira, just to see sort of what are your thoughts on that, especially to do with electrical waste and what can be done with partners to address this issue going forward. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lolade. I haven't worked closely on circular economy solutions for battery waste, but I'm aware that one of the big advantages with the electric power system over fossil-fueled one is that beyond the fact that electricity can be generated from renewable energy sources, a lot of the components can be reused and not necessarily wasted after first time of use. So if there are other panelists that have more insights on battery recycling, I think that will be welcome. On your second question, or did you want to say something, Lolade?
No, go ahead, please.
Okay. So, and then on your second question on South-South cooperation, I think there have been pre-existing challenges that have formed, barriers for renewable energy manufacturing and South-South cooperation. And then there are what I would call upcoming challenges or current challenges that we have. Some of the pre-existing ones include issues like high employment, inequality, resource dependence, the existing debt burden we're seeing across the global South. And then some of the current challenges or upcoming ones we're seeing around climate adaptation challenges, the need to manage a rapidly growing population, and doing all this while having to limit greenhouse gas emissions. So countries in the global South, we have to find a way to simultaneously navigate these two challenges. Some would require looking inward and fixing domestic problems. Others are better solved with cooperation among these global South countries. And since your question was specifically on South-South cooperation, I think there are many gaps on issues around trade reforms and the question of integrating supply chains to maximize economies of scale. Those are some of the major gaps that we're seeing from our work at ACF. It's still shocking that it's cheaper or easier to import some products from China into countries in Africa than to trade within Africa. So some of these barriers need to be reduced. And then finally, I'll just talk about the need for better knowledge exchange and use the example of South Africa with its JETP. So South Africa, as we may know, is farthest along in its JETP journey, so the Just Energy Transition Package journey. And after South Africa announced its JETP package in 2021, a few other countries announced similar packages, including Nigeria, Indonesia, and then much later, I think, anyway, a few other countries announced. So South Africa managed to use, because being the first country really to implement something of that nature, there were a lot of hurdles, challenges here and there that they had to find solutions to. And they shared that with other global South countries like Nigeria and Indonesia to make the path easier. So I think that's one example of how countries that are farther along in developing renewable energy value chains can share lessons, and then alongside that, institute reforms that allow for better trade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I mean, you touched on the point on financing and sort of knowledge sharing, and I'd like to move to Elbia just to speak about that a little bit. So Elbia, access to affordable and long-term financing remains a key barrier for renewable energy projects in the Global South. And this challenge is further compounded for manufacturing-related investments. Drawing on the experience of Brazil's National Bank for Economic and Social Development, what role can public financing play in supporting renewable energy deployment and catalyzing demand for local manufacturing?
Yeah, it's a very good point. As I said, we start our industry the first time with an important incentive program. After this, the industry starts to be strong with your auction model. But our auction model has a long-term contract. The contract is 20 years. Then the investors went on the auction and sell this energy, and they get a contract for 20 years. With this contract, the investor goes in the development bank and they take money to construction the site and they start the process. This is really a basis for guarantee the long term that you have a revenue with that investments. And this is to the guarantee for bank. And this is a base and is during this time for more than about 15 years that we have this model in auction. And in this time, we could construction this whole supply chain because with long-term contract, finance. But now we are living the third phase that it's a very interesting point because now our contract is signed in free market. And the free market has last time, it's about a 5 years contract or 10 years contract, but the development bank changed the model because before the financing contract was for 15 years. And now the development bank accepted the contract with 5 years. When this contract starts to finish, and they change for other contract with 5 years, and they have a swap of contract, but they maintain the guarantee and they receive the guarantee from investors. And our base changed a little, but now we just have the strong manufacturing industry. But right now, 2023, 2024, we are not in very good situation because the market in Brazil, it's not good because the economy, GDP, did increase in the last years. And right now, our private investors or company has no signed contract with consumer. We have a demand crisis now. And we are discussing how will you provide this market because our manufacturing companies is facing the first crisis in this industry. I believe that it is a short-term crisis because the economy will increase again. We are creating, right now, the government, the Brazilian government is creating an industrial policy. The big industrial policy, the big design, I believe that in medium and long term, we will cover this industry. But right now, the situation is not good exactly because the contract depends from free market and consumer right now don't want to contract because has no sure about the medium term future. It is a point, but the main point is about to create a long-term contract and use this contract as guarantee for fines.
Thank you so much, Albia, for sort of highlighting the role that contracting does play in ensuring there's that, investment security. And I do hope things do pick up in Brazil for the sector. We're coming towards the sort of the last 5 minutes of the webinar, and from discussions with our panelists, it's clear to see that the impact on policy and on how markets are shaped and developed regardless of geography, and the fact that we need to be very intentional about, putting up, multiple levers at the same time and implementing them simultaneously in order to really, really move the needle with regards to supporting renewable energy manufacturing and scaling it up across Africa. I'd like to thank you all for joining today's webinar, which is one in a series of dialogues we intend to host over the coming months. To our speakers, your engagement and insights have made the session truly enriching. I'd like to thank our partners, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Africa Climate Foundation, Climate Works Foundation, the Chinese Renewable Energies and Industries Association, and most importantly, our audience. We appreciate your time and look forward to connecting with you again in future events. So on that note, thank you very much, and we'll be wrapping up the webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.